There's this pervasive idea about sleep. The assumption is that if you can't sleep, you must be anxious, or you had too much caffeine, or your sleep hygiene is terrible. And if you're tired during the day, you just need to go to bed earlier.
Right, the moralization of sleep. If you're tired, you're doing something wrong. But if you have adrenal insufficiency, that whole framework just collapses. It's actually completely inadequate for describing what's going on.
Which is exactly why we're digging into this today. We're looking at a piece from My Adrenal Life. It's this incredibly grounded resource. The article is called Sleep Disorders Beyond Insomnia and Adrenal Insufficiency. And right up front, I want to remind everyone listening that there's a whole supportive community at myadrenallife.com. They also have a dedicated support and education group on Facebook. You just search My Adrenal Life to find the page and the group.
That community aspect is vital, actually, because the isolation of this specific symptom is profound. You go to your doctor, you say, I'm exhausted, but I keep waking up, and they tell you to try melatonin. But the article breaks down how sleep disruption in adrenal insufficiency goes way beyond classic insomnia. It's a physiological disruption.
It names 3 specific patterns: fragmented sleep, circadian misalignment, and daytime hypersomnolence. And it applies across the board: primary adrenal insufficiency, which is Addison's disease, secondary, tertiary, and steroid-induced adrenal insufficiency, because they all involve a disruption of the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. When that system is broken or suppressed, the way your body signals time and energy is fundamentally altered. Let's talk about the baseline first. Cortisol. We think of it as the stress hormone, the thing that spikes when you're late for a meeting or getting chased by a bear.
Which is true, it does do that. But its primary, everyday job is actually timing. Cortisol is the body's master clock. In a healthy system, cortisol production drops to its lowest point right around sleep onset. Then, somewhere between 2 and 4 a.m., it starts rising. It peaks right after you wake up, giving you the biological signal to be alert, and then it slowly tapers off throughout the day. So it's literally the biochemical mechanism of morning. Exactly. But in adrenal insufficiency, you don't have that endogenous rhythm. In primary AI, the adrenal glands just can't make the cortisol. In secondary or tertiary, the brain isn't sending the signal to make it. So you're reliant on exogenous replacement therapy. Pills, usually hydrocortisone or prednisone.
And the pills can't perfectly replicate that 2 a.m. rise.
They can't. Research published in the European Journal of Endocrinology actually highlights this as a major inadequacy of standard glucocorticoid replacement. Even with weight-adjusted, thrice-daily dosing, you cannot match that distinct circadian rhythm. You take a pill when you wake up, but you're missing that crucial pre-waking curve. And at night, your levels might be artificially low or artificially high, depending on when you took your last dose.
Which brings us to fragmented sleep. The article describes this as waking up multiple times without knowing why, never reaching deep sleep, feeling physically tired but completely unrestored.
Yes, and the literature backs this up heavily. Patients with adrenal insufficiency show decreased REM sleep and increased sleep fragmentation during nocturnal sleep. It's not just a subjective feeling of sleeping lightly. They are objectively failing to stay in those restorative sleep stages.
Wait, I have to jump in here. Is that purely physiological? Because living with a chronic, life-threatening illness is terrifying. Managing medications, fearing an adrenal crisis. Couldn't the sleep fragmentation just be a manifestation of the psychological burden? It's hard to sleep deeply when you're subconsciously worried about keeping yourself alive.
I mean, the psychological burden is real, absolutely. We'll definitely talk about the mental load. But no, the fragmentation is deeply physiological. The sleep architecture itself is altered by the lack of proper cortisol signaling. Cortisol actually plays a role in glucose regulation and autonomic stability overnight. If your cortisol drops too low, your blood sugar can become unstable. When blood glucose drops, the body panics.
Because low blood sugar is a threat to the brain.
Exactly. So the body compensates. It dumps adrenaline. It activates the sympathetic nervous system to bring glucose back up. And what does a dump of adrenaline do at 3 a.m.? It wakes you up. You might not realize your blood sugar dipped. You just know you suddenly snapped awake and your heart is pounding.
That autonomic activation, it's a survival mechanism overriding the sleep drive.
And the article points out this isn't always dramatic. It's not always a racing heart. Sometimes it just feels like fragile sleep. You're hovering right at the edge of wakefulness all night because the baseline physiologic stability isn't there. You're lacking the steady hormonal floor that allows the nervous system to truly power down into slow wave sleep.
That shifts how we understand the tired but wired feeling. The article calls this circadian misalignment. It's when your internal clock is just entirely out of sync with the actual time of day.
Right, which looks like feeling more awake late at night or struggling to fall asleep even when your body feels like lead, because again, cortisol is a clock gene in trainer. Studies show that glucocorticoid treatment actually phase shifts circadian clocks in peripheral cells throughout your body. Your liver, your muscles, they look to cortisol to know what time it is.
So if your medication timing is off, you're essentially giving your liver jet lag.
That is a perfect way to put it. You're giving your organs jet lag. If you take a dose too late in the afternoon trying to push through fatigue, your brain might be exhausted, but your peripheral tissues are receiving a chemical signal that says, it's morning, time to work. That mismatch creates this terrible friction where the body cannot coordinate the transition into sleep.
Which leads into daytime hypersomnolence, and the article is very careful to distinguish this from ordinary fatigue.
The distinction is crucial. Fatigue is, my muscles are heavy, I need to sit down. Hypersomnolence is a neurologic pull toward unconsciousness. It's trouble staying alert through routine tasks, brain fog that feels thick and insurmountable. It's sleeping at night, but still feeling completely unrefreshed, to the point where your body is just trying to shut down during the day.
I imagine that's partly the debt of the fragmented night.
It is. When you aren't getting prolonged REM sleep or slow wave sleep, your brain literally isn't clearing metabolic waste properly. But it's also this circadian mismatch. If your replacement therapy isn't perfectly mimicking that natural rise in the morning, which we know it usually can't, you start the day in a physiological deficit. A 2015 study in psychoneuroendocrinology actually linked the failure of replacement regimens to restore normal circadian rhythms with impaired memory and cognitive deficits in Addison's patients.
The article mentions that the unpredictability of all this is exhausting in its own right.
Because it's never just one variable. Sleep and adrenal insufficiency is influenced by blood sugar, physical stress, emotional strain, medication timing, and other hormone shifts. So you might do everything right, take your meds at the perfect time, eat a balanced dinner, use your blue light blocking glasses, and still have a terrible night because your body was fighting off a mild virus and needed more cortisol than you gave it.
That's the moving target of replacement therapy. You're acting as your own endocrine system, but you're operating with blunt instruments.
And the variables compound. The My Adrenal Life piece smartly brings up overlapping conditions. Things like thyroid disorders, which are highly prevalent in people with autoimmune primary adrenal insufficiency, or changes in estrogen and progesterone.
I'm looking at the section on sleep apnea. It says that because AI already affects energy, sleep apnea can layer on top of it and make the whole picture feel worse.
It's a huge issue. Sleep apnea causes repeated pauses in breathing, leading to frequent awakenings and non-restorative sleep. And here's the insidious part. Some research links glucocorticoid use with changes in fat distribution and muscle tone that could theoretically influence airway patency, though the data is complex. But simply having sleep apnea while also having adrenal insufficiency is a double hit to your oxygenation and your sleep architecture.
I don't know. I keep getting stuck on this idea of overlapping conditions. If someone has sleep apnea, or they're going through menopause, or they have a thyroid issue, isn't it possible that the adrenal insufficiency actually isn't the primary driver of the sleep problem? Maybe we're over-attributing fragmented sleep to the cortisol rhythm when it's really just the sleep apnea.
I see why you'd go there, but that assumes the body works in neat, isolated silos. It doesn't. If you have sleep apnea, every time you stop breathing, your body has to mount a stress response to wake you up and get you to breathe. In a healthy person, the adrenal glands release a surge of cortisol and adrenaline to manage that hypoxic stress. In someone with adrenal insufficiency, the adrenal glands can't do that. So the physiological toll of a sleep apnea event is vastly magnified. The baseline instability makes them infinitely more vulnerable to this secondary condition.
That makes sense. It's the lack of a buffer. The AI removes the shock absorbers, so every bump in the road hits the chassis.
Exactly. And the same goes for chronic pain, which the article mentions. Pain disrupts sleep positioning and depth. If you're managing multiple chronic conditions, pain is a constant low-level stressor. Without adequate cortisol coverage, that pain might trigger more autonomic arousal than it would in someone else.
The circular pattern here is brutal. Poor sleep worsens fatigue, lowers resilience, and increases emotional strain. And then that emotional strain makes it harder to sleep.
It's a feedback loop. And traditional medical advice often fails here because it focuses on behavior rather than biology. A doctor might say, you need better sleep hygiene. But sleep hygiene cannot fix a broken biological clock. It cannot fix a cortisol nadir that falls too low at 3 a.m. and triggers a hypoglycemic adrenaline surge.
Which is why the article emphasizes naming the pattern clearly, changing the language from I can't sleep to I wake repeatedly and don't feel restored, or my body feels out of sync.
Language is diagnostic. It gives patients the tools to advocate for themselves. If you tell an endocrinologist, I have insomnia, they might brush it off or suggest a sleeping pill. If you say, I'm experiencing severe daytime hypersomnolence despite sleeping 8 hours, and I have fragmented awakenings that feel like adrenaline surges, you are pointing them toward the medication timing and the endocrine mechanics.
This whole conversation really reframes what it means to manage this condition. It's not just taking a pill to not die. It's trying to manually operate a profoundly complex circadian machine.
That's exactly what it is, and the grace that is required to live that way is immense. The article ends with this gentle empowerment, the idea that if your sleep is broken, you are not failing. Your body is working under altered hormonal timing. It's real physiology, not weakness.
That's a beautiful landing point. It validates the exhaustion. Naming the reality of the physiology is its own form of support.
It really is. When the medical system dismisses your fatigue, finding a framework that explains it scientifically is incredibly anchoring. It takes the blame away.
If this resonated, or if you're trying to figure out your own sleep puzzle with AI, the community at myadrenallife.com is doing incredible work on this exact front. Go find their Facebook group, just search My Adrenal Life. Share this with someone who might be tired of explaining why they're so tired. The vocabulary matters.